In 1865, a mining engineer named Frederick Idestam walked along the banks of the Tamerkoski Rapids in southwestern Finland and decided to build a pulp mill. He had recently returned from Germany, where he had learned a new, cheaper method for manufacturing paper, and he believed Finland's endless forests and powerful rivers could turn that knowledge into a fortune. The operation was modest: a single mill, a handful of workers, logs dragged to the rapids, ground into pulp, pressed into sheets, and shipped off to buyers across the Russian Empire and Western Europe. The paper was good. Good enough, in fact, to win a bronze medal at the 1867 Paris World Exposition. Idestam is still remembered today as the father of Finland's paper industry. A few years after that first mill, he built a second one 15 kilometers away, on the banks of a smaller river called the Nokian Virta, near a quiet town called Nokia. He named his company after that town. Nokia AB was formally incorporated in 1871, and for decades, that is all it was: a paper mill. A Finnish paper mill making pulp from birch trees on the edge of the Arctic. Nobody alive at the time could have imagined what that company would become. Nobody could have predicted that this little factory in the Finnish countryside would one day produce nearly half the mobile phones on the planet, connect billions of human beings to one another, reshape the global economy, become synonymous with an entire era of technology, and then lose almost everything it had built in less than 6 years. This is the story of Nokia. And to understand how it rose and why it fell, you have to go back to the beginning. All the way back to the paper. After Idestam retired in 1896, his successor, Leo Meckelin, saw an opportunity beyond paper. The Nokian Virta River had rapids, and rapids meant hydropower. By 1902, Nokia had expanded into electricity generation. It was a logical move. The company already controlled the river. Why not harness it for more than grinding wood? Then, something happened that would change Nokia's trajectory forever. In 1898, a man named Edward Paulon founded a separate company called Finnish Rubber Works in the same town of Nokia. The rubber factory produced car tires, rubber boots, industrial gaskets, and all manner of rubber goods. A third company, Finnish Cable Works, was established in 1912 to produce telegraph wire, telephone cable, and power lines. These three companies, the paper mill, the rubber factory, and the cable works, were independent operations, but they shared a town, shared suppliers, and shared workers. They operated alongside each other for decades, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing for the same local resources. Finnish Rubber Works actually bought Nokia AB in 1918, partly to secure access to the paper mill's hydroelectric power. Finnish Cable Works joined the group in 1922, but even after these acquisitions, the three businesses continued to run as separate entities. They were neighbors, not partners. It wasn't until 1967 that the three companies formally merged into a single corporation, Nokia Corporation, a sprawling Finnish industrial conglomerate that manufactured paper, rubber boots, car tires, bicycle tires, toilet paper, television sets, power cables, telephone cables, and military communications equipment. It was a bizarre collection of products. A department store disguised as a corporation. But buried inside that conglomerate, in the electronics division, a few engineers were working on something that would change the world. Nokia's entry into telecommunications began in the 1960s, when its cable division started experimenting with radio transmission technology for the Finnish military. The work was quiet and unglamorous, mostly involving communication systems for the army and radio telephones for use in cars. Nobody outside the engineering department paid much attention to it. But in 1982, Nokia made a phone call that mattered. The company introduced the Mobira Senator, one of the world's first car phones, built for the Nordic Mobile Telephone Network, the NMT standard. The phone weighed almost 10 kilograms. It was expensive, impractical, and sold in small numbers, but it worked. and it proved that Nokia's engineers understood wireless communication at a fundamental level. A decade later, in 1991, something extraordinary happened. The Prime Minister of Finland, Harri Holkeri, made the world's first official GSM phone call using Nokia equipment. GSM, the global system for mobile communications, was the new pan-European digital cellular standard, and Nokia had been deeply involved in developing it. The company had poured resources into GSM research and standards negotiations throughout the 1980s, placing a big bet on a technology that most people still didn't understand. That bet was about to pay off in ways nobody could have imagined. The man who turned Nokia into a mobile phone superpower was Jorma Ollila. When Ollila became CEO in 1992, Finland was in crisis. The Soviet Union had just collapsed, and with it went a major trading partner. A banking crisis had erupted after deregulation. Unemployment was approaching 17%. Nokia itself was losing money. Ollila looked at the sprawling conglomerate he had inherited: the paper mills, the rubber factories, the tire production, the consumer electronics, the television manufacturing, and made a decision that most people thought was insane. He decided to sell everything that was not telecommunications. Everything. The paper, the rubber, the tires, the televisions, all of it. He was going to bet the entire company on mobile phones. It was considered an absurd gamble. Nokia was a minor player in a market dominated by Motorola and Ericsson, two established giants with deeper pockets and more experience. Motorola had invented the handheld mobile phone. Ericsson had a decades-long head start in network infrastructure. Nokia was a Finnish rubber boot company that happened to make some radio equipment. Who would take them seriously? The answer, it turned out, was everyone. Ollila understood something his competitors didn't. He understood that mobile phones were not going to remain expensive toys for businessmen and executives. They were going to become consumer products, mass market, affordable, personal. He understood that the phone you carried was going to become an extension of your identity, not just a tool. And he understood that design, ease of use, and brand identity mattered just as much as technical specifications. Under Ollila's leadership, Nokia transformed itself at a speed that still astonishes business historians. The company released phone after phone, each one cheaper, smaller, more reliable, and more appealing than the last. Nokia phones had clean designs, intuitive menus, long battery life, and a reputation for being virtually indestructible. They worked everywhere. They were affordable in Helsinki and Nairobi alike. By 1998, Nokia had surpassed Motorola to become the world's largest mobile phone manufacturer. The transformation took less than 6 years. A former rubber boot company was now the undisputed king of the fastest-growing consumer electronics market on the planet. And then came the product that would cement Nokia's legend forever. In September 2000, Nokia released the 3310. It cost around $100. It had a monochrome screen, physical buttons, and no camera. No internet browser, no apps, no touchscreen. What it had was a battery that lasted for days, a body that seemed to survive anything, drops off balconies, tumbles down stairs, encounters with concrete and asphalt that would destroy any modern smartphone in an instant. And it came loaded with a simple, hypnotic little game called Snake 2. The Nokia 3310 sold 126 million units. It became one of the best-selling consumer electronics products in history. It was not just a phone, it was a cultural phenomenon. It popularized text messaging. It turned mobile gaming into a pastime. Its interchangeable faceplates pioneered the idea of personalizing your phone. Even today, more than 2 decades later, the 3310 endures as one of the most recognizable objects in the history of technology. The internet is still full of memes about its indestructibility. Nokia's marketing team couldn't have bought that kind of brand loyalty if they'd spent $1 billion trying. But the 3310 was just the start. In 2003, Nokia released the 1100, a stripped-down, ultra-affordable phone designed specifically for developing countries. It had a built-in flashlight, a feature that sounds trivial, until you remember that hundreds of millions of people in rural India, sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia lived in areas with unreliable electricity. The flashlight became one of the phone's most beloved features. People used their Nokia 1100 as a torch in villages that didn't have streetlights. The Nokia 1100 sold over 250 million units. It remains, to this day, the best-selling mobile phone of all time. Not the best-selling smartphone, the best-selling mobile phone, period. More than the iPhone 6, more than any Samsung Galaxy, more than anything that has come before or since. At its peak, Nokia's product lineup was staggering in its breadth. In 2004 alone, the company introduced 36 different phone models, covering every conceivable price point and feature set. Cheap phones for first-time buyers in Lagos. Rugged phones for construction workers in São Paulo. Multimedia phones with cameras and music players for teenagers in London. Business phones with email and calendar integration for executives in New York. Nokia had a phone for everyone, everywhere, at every price, and they sold them by the hundreds of millions. The numbers from Nokia's golden age are almost hard to believe. In 1994, Nokia had released the 2100 series, which came preloaded with a ringtone adapted from a 19th century Spanish guitar piece called Gran Vals by Francisco Tárrega. That ringtone, known simply as the Nokia tune, became the most widely heard melody in human history. At its peak, it was estimated to play 1.8 billion times a day around the world. More people heard the Nokia tune on a daily basis than any piece of music ever composed. Between 1996 and 2001, Nokia's revenues skyrocketed from 6.5 billion euros to over 31 billion euros. By 2007, the company's annual revenue had climbed past 51 billion euros. Nokia sold 435 million handsets in 2007 alone. The company controlled approximately 40% of the entire global mobile phone market. In some measurements and some quarters, that number reached nearly 50%. Nokia sold its billionth phone in 2005. Think about that for a moment. 1 billion phones. From a former paper mill in a country of 5 million people, Nokia's importance to Finland was almost impossible to overstate. At its peak, the company accounted for roughly 4% of Finland's entire gross domestic product. It represented about a quarter of Finnish economic growth during its boom years. It funded approximately 45% of all business sector research and development in the country. Nokia was responsible for almost a quarter of Finland's total exports. Nokia didn't just build phones, it built modern Finland. The company's market capitalization peaked at close to 110 billion euros on the Helsinki Stock Exchange in 2007. By comparison, the entire country's GDP was roughly 186 billion euros that year. A single corporation, born from a paper mill, was worth more than half the economic output of the nation it called home. And then Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco. On January 9, 2007, Jobs stood before the audience at Macworld and introduced the iPhone. He described it as 3 products in one: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. The audience cheered. Tech journalists wrote breathless reviews, and at Nokia's headquarters in Espoo, Finland, the reaction was something closer to a shrug. Nokia's leadership was not worried. Publicly, CEO Olli-Pekka Kalasvuo, who had succeeded Ollila in 2006, said Nokia had nothing to worry about. Internally, the sentiment was even more dismissive. The iPhone had no physical keyboard. It had a terrible camera. Its battery life was poor. It couldn't even send MMS messages at launch. It was expensive. It was available only on one carrier in one country. Nokia was selling nearly half the phones on the planet. Apple's market share was a rounding error, and the thing is, on paper, they were right. In late 2007, Nokia still controlled around 50% of the global smartphone market. Apple's share was approximately 5%. Nokia's own N95, released in early 2007, was in many ways a more capable device than the first iPhone. It had a 5-megapixel camera with Carl Zeiss optics. It had built-in GPS, it had Wi-Fi. It had a music player, video recording, and expandable storage. It could do things the iPhone couldn't. Nokia's engineers were not stupid. They knew hardware. They knew mobile. They had been doing this longer than anyone, but they missed the most important thing. The iPhone was not competing with Nokia's phones on specifications. It was making the entire concept of a specification-driven phone obsolete. The iPhone was not about megapixels or GPS chips. It was about the experience, the smooth scrolling, the pinch to zoom, the fluid, intuitive touchscreen interface that made every other phone feel like a relic. And behind it all, Apple was building an ecosystem, the App Store, iTunes, iCloud, that would lock in customers and developers in a way that hardware alone never could. Nokia's leadership didn't see it, or rather, they saw it and didn't believe it mattered. And that failure of imagination would cost them everything. Here's the part of the story that most people don't know. Nokia was not caught entirely off guard by the touchscreen revolution. The company's own engineers had developed touchscreen prototypes as early as the late 1990s. Nokia had the technology. What it didn't have was the will to disrupt itself. The problem was Symbian. Nokia's operating system, Symbian OS, had been the dominant mobile platform for years. It ran on hundreds of millions of phones. It had a massive installed base, and it was, by 2007, hopelessly outdated. Symbian had been designed for an era of small screens, physical keypads, and limited internet connectivity. Adapting it for the touchscreen era was like trying to renovate a mud hut into a skyscraper. The foundation was wrong. Nokia's engineers knew this. They told management. They proposed alternatives. Some even suggested adopting Android, the open-source mobile operating system that Google had unveiled in late 2007, and that was rapidly gaining traction. But management dismissed these warnings. Symbian was familiar. Symbian was cheap to license. Symbian had market share. Why fix what wasn't broken? Except it was broken, and it was getting worse. Developing new features for Symbian was agonizingly slow. One Nokia employee reportedly joked that Chinese manufacturers could design, build, and ship an entire phone in the time it took Nokia to polish a PowerPoint presentation about one. The bureaucracy had become suffocating. Fear permeated the organization. Employees protected their careers instead of innovating. Bad news didn't flow upward. Decisions were made in isolation by executives who were increasingly disconnected from the reality of the market. In late 2007, Google announced the formation of the Open Handset Alliance and the development of Android. Samsung, HTC, LG, and dozens of other manufacturers jumped on board. A second front had opened in the smartphone war, and Nokia was now fighting on two fronts, against Apple from above and Android from below, with an operating system that couldn't keep up with either. By 2010, the situation was dire. Nokia's smartphone market share had fallen from roughly 50% to about 30% and was dropping fast. Apple had sold 47.5 million iPhones that year. Samsung was shipping 23 million smartphones and climbing rapidly. Nokia was still selling over 100 million smartphone units, but the trajectory was unmistakable. The line was pointing down. And it was pointing down fast. In September 2010, Nokia's board made a decision that would become one of the most debated moves in corporate history. They hired Stephen Elop, a former Microsoft executive, as the company's new CEO. He was the first non-Finnish CEO in Nokia's 145-year history. Elop surveyed the wreckage and, on February 8, 2011, sent a roughly 1,300-word internal memo to every Nokia employee. The memo was not intended for the public. It leaked almost immediately and became one of the most famous corporate communications in technology history. Elop compared Nokia to a man standing on a burning oil platform in the North Sea. The man is surrounded by flames. Below him is the freezing ocean. He has to jump or die. The memo was blunt to the point of brutality. Elop wrote that the first iPhone had shipped in 2007, and Nokia still didn't have a product that was close to that experience. He wrote that Android had come on the scene just over 2 years ago, and had that week taken Nokia's leadership position in smartphone volumes. He wrote that Symbian was non-competitive in leading markets. He wrote that Nokia had poured gasoline on its own burning platform. He wrote that the company had lacked accountability and leadership. He wrote that Nokia had had a series of misses, that it hadn't been delivering innovation fast enough, that it wasn't collaborating internally. And then he wrote the line that became the memo's epitaph. Nokia, our platform is burning. He was right about the diagnosis. The question was whether the cure would be worse than the disease. 3 days after the memo leaked, Elop announced Nokia's new strategy. The company would abandon Symbian. It would abandon MeeGo, the next-generation Linux-based operating system that Nokia had been developing as Symbian's successor. Instead, Nokia would adopt Microsoft's Windows Phone as its primary smartphone platform. The announcement sent Nokia's stock price plunging 14% in a single day, and it triggered a devastating unintended consequence. By publicly declaring Symbian dead, Elop had given every Nokia customer in the world a reason to stop buying Nokia phones immediately. Why would you buy a Symbian phone when the CEO of the company had just told the entire planet that Symbian was a burning platform? Sales collapsed almost overnight. It was the corporate equivalent of a doctor announcing to the waiting room that the patient was terminal before even starting treatment. And there was the MeeGo problem. Nokia had been developing MeeGo in partnership with Intel as a potential Symbian replacement, and a MeeGo-based phone, the Nokia N9, was nearly ready for release. When the N9 finally launched later in 2011, it received strong reviews from critics and unexpected enthusiasm from consumers. The touchscreen interface was innovative, the design was beautiful, and the user experience was fluid and modern. The N9 was proof that Nokia still had the engineering talent to compete. But it didn't matter. Elop had already declared MeeGo dead. The N9 became a symbol of what might have been, the road not taken. Nokia began releasing Windows Phone devices under the Lumia brand. The Lumia 800 and 900 arrived in late 2011 and early 2012. The hardware was praised. Nokia's industrial design was as good as ever, but Windows Phone had a fatal problem: apps, or rather, the lack of them. Developers weren't building for Windows Phone. The app ecosystem was barren compared to iOS and Android. Consumers didn't want a beautiful phone with a beautiful screen if they couldn't get Instagram, Snapchat, or their banking app on it. And developers didn't want to build for a platform that consumers weren't buying. It was a death spiral. No apps meant no users. No users meant no apps. The numbers tell the story with merciless clarity. During Elop's 3 years as CEO, Nokia's revenues fell 40%. Profits fell 95%. Smartphone market share collapsed from 34% to 3.4%. Nokia's credit rating was downgraded from A to junk status. The company's share price dropped by 60%. Nokia's market capitalization hemorrhaged roughly $13 billion in value. The Financial Times would later calculate that Nokia shareholders ended up paying Elop a bonus of approximately €1 million for every 1.5 billion in market capitalization he destroyed. The company that had shipped 463 million phones in 2007 shipped just 4.4 million in 2013. On September 3, 2013, Microsoft announced that it would acquire Nokia's devices and services business for €5.44 billion, approximately $7.2 billion. The deal included a 10-year patent license. Roughly 32,000 Nokia employees transferred to Microsoft. The transaction closed in April 2014. Stephen Elop returned to Microsoft as an executive vice president and received a departure bonus package of €18.8 million, a payout that Finland's prime minister at the time publicly called outrageous. The deal was a catastrophe for Microsoft too. In 2015, Microsoft wrote down $7.6 billion on the acquisition, more than the purchase price, and laid off approximately 25,000 employees, most of them former Nokia workers. In 2016, Microsoft sold the feature phone assets and the Nokia brand rights to Foxconn and a Finnish company called HMD Global for roughly $350 million. To put that number in perspective, Nokia's mobile phone business had gone from a market valuation in the neighborhood of $99 billion to a sale price of $350 million in less than a decade. That's a loss of over 99% of its value. The question that haunts every analysis of Nokia's fall is whether it was inevitable. Could Nokia have survived the smartphone revolution? Could it have adapted? The honest answer is complicated. Nokia's engineers were brilliant. They had the technology, they had the patents, they had the manufacturing scale and the distribution network to reach every corner of the planet. They had a brand that billions of people trusted and loved. What they didn't have was a culture that was willing to cannibalize its own success. They didn't have leadership that was willing to endure short-term pain for long-term survival. And they didn't have an operating system that could compete in the new world. If Nokia had adopted Android in 2010 or 2011, as Samsung did, it's entirely possible that the company could have become one of the dominant smartphone makers of the 2010s. Nokia's hardware design was excellent. Its global distribution network was unmatched. Its brand was still strong in dozens of countries. The combination of Nokia hardware and Android software could have been formidable, but Nokia chose Windows Phone instead, and that choice was fatal. Some analysts believe the decision was driven by Elop's Microsoft background. Others argue that Nokia's board feared becoming dependent on Google's ecosystem, which would have reduced Nokia to a commodity hardware manufacturer. Still others point to the financial incentives Microsoft offered Nokia to adopt Windows Phone. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Nokia chose a dying platform and died with it. Nokia's story did not end with the Microsoft sale. The company retained its network infrastructure business, its mapping division, and its patent portfolio. In 2015, Nokia acquired Alcatel-Lucent, the Franco-American telecommunications equipment giant, for 15.6 billion euros, reinventing itself as one of the world's leading providers of 5G network infrastructure. Nokia today is a legitimate player in the telecommunications equipment market, competing with Ericsson, Huawei, and Samsung networks for contracts to build the backbone of the world's wireless networks. HMD Global, the Finnish company that bought the Nokia phone brand from Microsoft, began releasing Nokia-branded Android smartphones in 2017. That same year, HMD relaunched the Nokia 3310 as a nostalgia product, complete with a color screen and the classic Snake game. The phone sold for 49 euros. People bought it for sentimental reasons. It was a love letter to a lost era. But Nokia's phone business is a shadow of what it once was. The company that once controlled nearly half the global mobile phone market now holds less than 1% of the smartphone market. The brand persists, but the empire is gone. What happened to Nokia is not simply a story about a company that failed to adapt to new technology. It's a story about the dangers of success itself. Nokia didn't fail because its people were incompetent. It failed because its success made it afraid to abandon a profitable platform, afraid to cannibalize its own products, afraid to take the kind of risks that had built the company in the first place. Jorma Ollila had been willing to sell the paper mills and the rubber factories and bet everything on mobile phones. That was the Nokia that conquered the world. But by the mid-2000s, Nokia had become the kind of company that Ollila's younger self would have disrupted. It was big, bureaucratic, internally political, and structurally incapable of the kind of radical self-reinvention that the smartphone era demanded. The company that had once been the disruptor had become the disrupted. Finland felt the loss deeply. At Nokia's peak, the company had accounted for approximately 4% of the entire country's GDP, roughly a quarter of its total exports, and nearly half of all business research and development spending. When Nokia collapsed, an estimated 60,000 jobs disappeared from Finland in related industries. The country's economy, which had been among the strongest in Europe during the Nokia boom years, stagnated for the better part of a decade. But there's a coda to that part of the story too. Many of the engineers and designers and product managers who were laid off from Nokia went on to start their own companies. Finland's startup ecosystem, which today includes companies like Supercell, the maker of Clash of Clans, and Rovio, the creator of Angry Birds, was built in large part by former Nokia employees. The talent didn't vanish. It scattered and regrew. The Nokia story is one of the great cautionary tales in business history. It's the story of a paper mill that became a rubber factory, that became a cable company, that became an electronics conglomerate, that became the most dominant mobile phone manufacturer the world had ever seen. And then lost almost everything because it couldn't bring itself to change. At its peak, Nokia connected billions of people. It put a phone in the hands of farmers in India and fishermen in Kenya and teenagers in Helsinki and executives in Tokyo. It helped build the infrastructure of the modern connected world. Its ringtone was the most heard melody on Earth. Its phones were so durable they became a punchline, and so beloved they became a meme. For a brief and brilliant moment, Nokia was not just a company. It was a verb. It was how the world communicated. And then the world moved on. The paper mill on the banks of the Nokian Virta River is long gone. The rubber boots and bicycle tires are a footnote. The mobile phone empire that once generated 51 billion euros a year in revenue has been sold, written down, and sold again for pennies on the dollar. What remains is a telecommunications equipment company with a respectable business in 5G infrastructure, a licensing operation that earns royalties on a portfolio of 20,000 patents, and a name that still makes people over 30 smile with a faint pang of nostalgia. Nokia's story is a reminder that in technology, nothing is permanent. Not dominance. Not market share. Not even love. The company that was too big to fail was not too big to fall. And the phone that was too tough to break could not survive the world that broke around it.